I'm Jason. I'm a professor here at ICSAP and also one of the co-PIs of the REAL project, together with CALAS, who unfortunately is not able to make it this morning because of one of his dogs, but will be here at the acting to see Sabrina. And also together with Professor Julia Steinberger at Lausanne. I'm very excited to have the opportunity to introduce Dr. Sabrina Fernandes. Sabrina is a Brazilian sociologist and political economist and the head of research at the Alameda Institute. She holds a PhD from Carleton University, Canada, and is formerly a postdoctoral fellow with the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and also with the Center for Advanced Latin American Studies. So I first encountered Sabrina's work several years ago. I was impressed because she was making extremely strong arguments for eco-socialist transition using that word, which I think was pretty uncommon at the time. And her arguments were rooted in Southern struggles for liberation and global justice. And furthermore, she was breaking through with people in a really spectacular way. Sabrina is not just an intellectual and talented scholar, but also an extremely effective communicator. I spoke to people in Brazil who told me that she was contributing towards a kind of renaissance of socialist ideas there. Later in 2022, I saw that Sabrina teamed up with Mike Lowy, Jurgis, and several other scholars to write a little manifesto on eco-socialist degrowth, which was published in Monthly Review. I loved it, and that piece was a kind of catalyst that I think helped unite these two tendencies, and both have become significantly stronger as a result. And then the following year, Sabrina was involved in establishing another experimental document, the Pact South, which is a collective call for an eco-social energy transition that repudiates dynamics of Green Colonialism. Sabrina's talk today is titled Just Transitions in the Polycrisis, Latinate Alternatives to Green Colonialism. Please join me in welcoming Sabrina Fernandes, and thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much, Jason. That's very kind. I hope I have the opportunity to have you in one of our spaces and also introduce you with all the impact that you've had on my research as well. So thank you so much. It's great to be here today. Thanks, Charles, for helping set all of this up. We were in London at the War on Want event in February, just talking about transition, talking about Palestine, talking about the changes that we need to make. And because I was coming to Barcelona with my collective, a small delegation from the Eco-Social Pact from the South, and I thought, well, that's an opportunity to, have a little bit more of an exchange and also think of ways for collaborating the directions that we're trying to take on here. I apologize about my voice. It's apparently spring in Barcelona and there's a lot of pollen in the air. So the asthmatic person that I am struggling a little bit. But I've also found that you have very good medication for it. So I had a very good night of sleep because of that. So one of the reasons why I proposed this topic, because it has to do with a lot of the things that I've been doing in my research, things that we're doing at the Alameda Institute. That's a small institute, very young. We're only 1 year old, and I've only been with the institute since September officially. But we're doing a lot of stuff on transition, always from this internationalist lens, which is not just about looking to geopolitical dynamics, but looking to struggles, how you connect these struggles, and how they may help us address some of the contradictions that pop up whenever we're talking about climate change, ecological crisis, and the different programs and debates that arise from it. But obviously, since I am here today, it's May 13th, and we're in the middle of a crisis in Brazil. While we're in the Eco-Social Pact from the South, we call this a localized collapse because, here in Barcelona, it's dry. But for over a week now, one of the states in Brazil, the southernmost state, Rio Grande do Sul, has been 80% of the territory affected by an unprecedented amount of flooding. We're talking about 1.4 million people currently impacted, hundreds of thousands displaced. Some people are still stuck in their apartment buildings, in their houses. The rivers, they're still going up. So the Guaíba region in the capital of Porto Alegre, it was over 5 meters now, and it's still rising. We expect that maybe in 4 to 5 days, it will start going down, but the temperatures are dropping. So temperatures are starting to drop close to 0 degrees Celsius. Sometimes people, like, when we think of Brazil, they think of like them cold, but Rio Grande do Sul gets very cold. And like we're having a huge crisis. It is what I'm like calling like a climate humanitarian calamity, because the country is not prepared to handle this. Even though right now we're under a progressive government that's negotiating in good faith around climate change, we have huge deficits in terms of implementation around adaptation projects. And I also have a lot of criticism with the way the left in Brazil and in Latin America in general has been handling the transition debates. There's still a lot of developmentalism around it. We'll be talking about it, but these are just some images. We don't know when this is going to dry completely, and when it does, these houses are gone. So the efforts around reconstruction right now, they're already estimated this to be in around 10 to 15 billion euros for the reconstruction of the state. It's a level of loss and damage that we had never seen before in Brazil. And just to give some perspective, the floods were in Barcelona. This is it, right? People are getting rescued with choppers. This is the capital of the state. It's like a major, beautiful urban area, and it's all mud right now, and it's an ongoing thing. So we're dealing with, right now, rescue. You can see from over here that the normal surface water is in blue. So here the ocean, and then the river basin, or everything that is in red is extra additional flood. This gives a lot of context about when we're talking what we're facing right now. Climate change is no longer a problem for the future. It is quite the reality right now. But when we're discussing transition, it always brings this idea that we have time, and we're in a little bit of a rush, or technology is going to solve us, and all these little debates. But our targets are like 2030, 2050. Our targets are always in the future. The problems are right here, right now. And just in the past week, we've had floods in Turkey. We've had floods in China. And we're not even I could go on around droughts and big storms and all of the other things that are happening. I could go for hours. But if you just Google and you talk about transition, talk about green transition, you're going to get a lot of images that are solar panels and tech and green little logos. But when you talk about green extractivism, you just get into the earth opening up, right? So this idea of open pit mines. And I think one of the challenges that we have, where we're reaching these global north, global south discussions, and we're looking into supply chains, and we're looking into the actual impacts around talking of technology and technological transfer and mitigation adaptation, is always trying to track it back to the origin. And when we track it back to the origin, we find the same patterns of inequality, of dispossession being replicated, and there's a lot of violence around it. So I'm challenging us to always make sure that when we're talking about the green transition, we're not using the shiny things in order to hide the very ugly, dirty patterns that are being reproduced. And what does it have to do with the polycrisis, right? Polycrisis is a concept that is a bit of a buzzword right now. But for us, both at Alameda and the Eco-Social Pact, it's an interesting term because we've been talking about a permanent crisis for a really long time. Countries that live a post-colonial reality here, in quotes, are countries that know crisis from everyday life, because a cost of living crisis has always been a thing. Unemployment crisis, always a thing. Economic crisis, severe levels of indebtedness in these countries, coups, authoritarian regimes, dispossession all over the place. Our indigenous communities are still living under huge pressures and amounts of violence, no traditional rights being acknowledged. So, it's important to bring in the polycrisis so we understand that it's not just a lot of crises at the same time. They're actually building on each other. They're actually making each other worse. But also because solutions that are being presented to nodes in the polycrisis sometimes are creating really bad problems somewhere else. So by troubling the polycrisis, we don't want to just look into the interconnections between the crises. We want to figure out where a solution that seems perfect in one place is a huge problem somewhere else, and make sure that we're addressing these type of inequalities. So solution creation, sometimes approach from governance institutions, hide certain things around it. So the big debate coming from COP last year in Dubai, and also like Egypt, a lot of stuff on loss and damage. What do we do with the loss and damage fund? This is a huge issue because we're trying to address, the ecological debt, the climate debt, the inequalities around capacity. The most vulnerable countries are paying the cost and they can't do that. And one of the things we were always mentioning is that countries like Pakistan, Bahamas, now Brazil, whenever we're dealing with huge costs connected to loss and damage, this comes as debt. It's either internal debt creation or external debt creation. And very famous world institutions are part of this, right? It's the IMF, it's the World Bank. So in our discussions for a truly just loss and damage fund, that should not be a part of it. Structural adjustment should not be a part of it. This level of external intervention should not be a part of it because they have been creating crises that reproduce each other for a really long time. Yet, who's the interim host of the loss and damage funds right now? The World Bank. So we keep getting back into the same system, like where we're still feeding the same financial infrastructure around it. Even the so-called Green Climate Fund, where the richer countries were promising $100 billion for mitigation adaptation in the global south. First of all, they never matched the $100 billion. And when they do put some effort in, the majority of the investments come out as loans and not grants. And some of this is also skewing other issues, because what we find is that with loans, there is a tendency to go towards mitigation and not adaptation, because it's harder for you to assess the kind of gain, profitable gain or gain to the GDP, to economic growth that you will get from the same way that we get from mitigation. So mitigation, they say, let's build this huge infrastructure around renewables. We'll be able to associate the price with it. And then all of the green capitalist investors are going to come in. You're going to have a new flux of capital around it. Mitigation seems to be a focus. With adaptations, sometimes it's just rebuilding somebody's house that got taken away by a flood. And value, as we all know it from being here, the discussions that we're having for a really long time, it's always associated with what you can get in terms of the GDP and what you can get in terms of capital flows here. So the conversations around support from the global north to the global south are very, very skewed in that situation. So they're not addressing the things that we need to address. We have other issues around it. That sometimes, yes, you have loans and you have grants, but they're being channeled towards specific institutions that are not really respecting fundamental rights. And I'm going to get into that in a little bit. But we end up seeing this whole process, something that we call a tunnel vision. And in the, Renaud Bringot and Maristela Svampa from the Eco-Social Pact have been discussing this in terms of a decarbonization consensus. What is a decarbonization consensus? It doesn't mean that there's actual decarbonization at large going on. It means that this idea that fossil capital and green capital, they're separate things, which they're actually not. They're working together quite well. ExxonMobil is doing decarbonization, and Total Energies doing decarbonization. The Petrobras National Oil Company in Brazil, they're doing decarbonization. They use decarbonization as a channel in terms of greenwashing for their regular operations, but also as a way of perpetuating fossil fuels in general, because now they can go ahead and they can talk about lower carbon fossil fuels. They can say that, well, you're abating, because if you go back to the UN, the huge problem that we have at COPs that you never actually talk about a fossil fuel phase out. Now they talk about reducing or prohibiting certain levels of unabated fossil fuels. So what do? Well, we're going to abate it. We're going to use CCS technologies that are largely unproven and leads to terrible accounting around carbon, they're going to go into the carbon market. Offset schemes are also like 90% bullshit credits around that. Credits are also associated with taking away the autonomy and sovereignty of indigenous and traditional communities all over the place, or basically creating a credit out of something that was already, a forest that was already there. It's not additional at all. So all of these problems come in, but it's very useful for them because then you get like your ESG certificates and you get into certain investors and funds. So like this perspective that fossil capital is a problem and then green capital is another problem, we want to make sure that we're always looking at these through a specific lens. And some of the work that I've been doing myself in terms of like Latin America is looking to how green hydrogen is the next big thing in terms of the creation of a commodity that connects fossil capital and green capital, because they're building green hydrogen plants so they can use it for the desulfurization process in the oil refineries. So you're going to, rather than using gray hydrogen coming from fossil fuels as well, you bring in green hydrogen, you lower your emissions, now your oil is greener in a certain sense, and it's easier on how you place yourself in the market, and you're also using the state to de-risk your investments. So the de-risking element here is very important because the states are inclined or pressured to move forward on climate change, to do transition. So then you go in and then you start a cooperation project or like a green hydrogen hub, and we're actually like doing technological transfer here and like knowledge transfer. But it is with the purpose of building a new commodity system that technologically is not so viable yet. Huge issues around storing and transportation of green hydrogen. But they're already putting green hydrogen hubs for the development of plants in the northeast of Brazil, in the La Guajira region in Colombia, which is a place that we consider a green sacrifice zone from mining, and is about to turn into a green sacrifice zone for the production of wind power into a green hydrogen plants. Same thing is happening in Chile. When we talk about Chile, a lot of people think of lithium as one of the issues, but the green hydrogen plants that came from the previous right-wing government and now got readapted with social consultation under the Portuguese government, they still have this perspective that you don't have a green sacrifice zone from green hydrogen in Magallanes in the south because there are no people there. So this is colonial thinking as well. One is considering that if there are no people, then you can just go and grab it. Who cares about nature in that sense? Who cares about biodiversity and ecosystemic stability? So you have a tunnel vision here because you're not looking to the ecological system. You're just looking to decarbonization. And it's also the way that they're justifying certain mining projects at the bottom of the ocean because it's a conflict-free zone. International waters, there are no people there. So everything's up for grab, right? Like these green extractivist frontiers, they're really expanding this way. And there's a problem that we find here in terms of like interdependence, because things are starting to collapse in certain areas, but the commodity system is still flowing quite well. And a lot of governments in the global south are seeing this as a huge opportunity, even though like when I'm doing interviews, when I'm talking to people and I ask them, yeah, but how are you going to ship all this green hydrogen from northeast Brazil to Germany? I get like these faces.
Oh, then.
Because it's like this belief that somebody's going to fix it. Technology, if we don't have the answer quite well, it's because technology hasn't gotten there yet, but it will get there. So it's purely a scientific way of planning how we deal with energy resources, but it's a way of keeping the demand as it is today. It's how a lot of governments in the global south were saying we're not going to be dependent anymore because we are doing together. It's not like they're coming with a corporation just taking our energy in terms of this commodity. We're doing it together. But in the end, rather than making sure that people who have no access to proper electricity from any source gets access, stable, for the first time, we're building huge solar and wind power plants for the green hydrogen process in order to export it. So it's one of the things around it. And it's so this is creating like all of these conditions that we inherited from the past, they're getting exacerbated again. So like colonialism, indebtedness, low integration, because they usually come like with a state-to-state process. And when they do come from like large associations of like states, it's usually through free trade agreements. So we run into another problem around it. You don't have like territorial integration. The dependent economy is still a problem around it, ecological imperialism, and standard imperialism as well that we know around resource grabs, quite common. So if we're troubling the polycrisis with all these battles here, we understand that yes, there are things happening, wars, pandemics, climate crisis, all of these other things, food insecurity, absence of care systems, increased cost of living, industrial animal exploitation, the sacrifice zones. They are part of a system that's constantly reproducing itself. So like tropical see very well right on top, so like there's extractivism there, which is like a main focus that we have at the Eco-Social Pact. But understanding how these systems of oppression are very much interlinked. So not just the matter of the indigenous communities, but formerly enslaved Black communities as well, what happens around environmental racism, the types of zoning around sacrifice zones, this is all very key as well. And huge element of militarization behind all of this. So this is something that's becoming more explicit to people through Gaza right now. All the different interests around the military incursion by Israel into Gaza and the connections between the Israeli state and other types of normalization. So, for example, even though some governments in Latin America made progress in terms of like calling what's happening a genocide, a lot of the economic agreements are still going through, or the military cooperation that's still going through. And recently we had piece of propaganda in Brazil that the Elbit Systems, which was one of the like major Israeli tech military companies, it has operations in Brazil, in Porto Alegre, so in the capital city affected by the flood. And but they're offering drones that are helping to locate people, right? So that this level of like it's like humanitarian efforts by Elbit during the climate crisis. It's just really absurd how these things happen. So we are required to bring in all of these contradictions, extract what we can out of it to create strategy. And climate is just a major catalyst in this entire problem. So like the climate humanitarian calamities, they're going to become ever more common and simultaneous, to the point that this is creating many different types of issues here. The humanitarian system itself throughout the world, and at Alameda we work a lot with charities and humanitarian partners to try to understand that you could raise a lot of money is never going to be enough for the amount of loss and damage that we're facing here. The risks for the humanitarians on the ground, they're becoming ever worse, more complicated. And just the basic fact that you can't really put a price on the loss of life in general, not just human life, but life in general on the planet. So it requires us to go to the root cause. It requires a radical way of thinking of how collapse, catastrophe, and disaster happen around it. And we understand that from the false solutions, we're getting to false transitions. We're having replacements rather than like having like a proper phase out. So like in certain industries, they are replacing fossil fuels with some level of green energy, renewables, and things like that, but we're actually not getting away from the dependence. This is a problem when we're looking at states. They're very dependent on fossil fuels as well. And this is a huge market opportunity because if you look into the marketing for Total Energies, it's like rainbow colors and, these fields of solar panels, and it's so beautiful because now we're no longer an oil company, we're an energy company. So we're seeing diversification of portfolios. This is what happens. And that famous, unfortunately, book by Bill Gates on climate change, precisely that. Like how you expand your investment portfolio around tech and around different types of resources around the world. So these approaches are very reductionist. They're just helping to perpetuate fossil capital through a green capital lens. We're having uneven transitions, and I'm going to get into this in a little bit, and just super slow. We're just absolutely behind. But the thing is that when collapse happens, it's fast. Like we have like a permanent track of ecocide because we are moving towards more and more localized disasters. But when something does collapse, it's really fast, and it's really hard to like have a system prepared to deal with it. This gets into my research on sovereignty. Like I've been doing some stuff around it for a really long time, basically coming from like what Jason mentioned earlier, like, oh, so these engagements with like the Brazilian left and like socialist thinking. And then have like what I would consider a more like backwards, stuck in the past approach to sovereignty that we sometimes find in the global south, that because we are facing imperialist forces, countries coming in and intervening in our politics or like military coups and things like that, we need to assert our sovereignty. So they can't come and they can't take our oil. We need to do it ourselves. And so this idea of like oil-based sovereignty is still very strong, but it's just so much in the rhetoric and not really the reality, because when Petrobras is actually auctioning off oil fields in Brazil, it's doing it with Shell. But because our national company is required to be part of the deal, then it's fine because Shell is not getting 100%. They're partnering up with us. But then again, our company is not 100% public and closed off. It's actually out in the market. So we have shareholders from all over the place. So it is like, it doesn't match the material reality in terms of the discourse. And of course, you should understand that this perspective around sovereignty that's based on competition, states against states, and it's based on asserting your dominance inside national borders in terms of our resources, and we're just going to reproduce the same productive system around them, but it is going to be us doing it. It's also super outdated because there's no chance of lasting. The climate crisis puts us in a situation where the current discourses on sovereignty is sovereignty with an expiry date. When I look at these images of Brazil right now and the collapse in Rio Grande do Sul, that territory does not look like a sovereign territory to me. It's a major disaster. People are having to do like crowdfunding to help each other out because medicine is not reaching people. Roads are closed off. We're having like problems around criminal activity. There are people describing it in terms of like it's a warlike situation. But just a year ago, in the same month of May last year, environmentalists were being attacked in Brazil for denouncing the desires and plans of Petrobras to drill for oil at the basin of the Amazon River. And now, just a year later, that's right. And now they all know we need to talk about climate. But the fear is that in about 6 months, the register to keep perpetuating fossil capital is going to be there. And we end up having this global north, global south perspective here, but they're not that binary. Because the elites, they bridge this. And some of the former perspectives within the labor movement, within the working class, they also bridge this. But basically, in richer countries where they're thinking we want green hydrogen and solar and power and this reduction of transition to just the energy component of it, which is like very common and it's part of the carbon tunnel vision and the decarbonization consensus. Well, it's like, we're going to go, we need this. And it's not just like an European approach, a US approach. China does this a lot. It does have like a lot of cooperation projects around it, either through breaks or like more directly country to country. But it's still going to make sure that they have a lot of strategic minerals in their own land, but they want to make sure that they can access in other places as well. So this issue of access, we've always been first. We've always been developing at the cost of others or some of these other emergent economies that go into different dynamics that I wouldn't describe as imperialist, but like expansionist or semi-periphery dynamics in the sort of sense. Hamza is coming here as well, I think, right? You can ask Hamza. Hamza and I have a lot of debates on like, what do we call these other states and what they're doing around it in terms of not be properly described as imperialism or sub-imperialism. So I think you should ask him a question about it. Like, we love talking about it. But it is like, yeah, first us. We're going, and then, but we're doing operational. It's not the way that we did it before. So here's some like leftover, tech, scraps, a little bit of knowledge, but still in our own terms. So you have these chauvinistic transition projects, and they end up reproducing Green Colonialism. We just came out with 2 books in English. This one, The Geopolitics of Green Colonialism, was co-edited by 2 research groups, one of them associated with the Eco-Social Pact. I have a chapter at the end of it with my colleague and comrade Breno Bringo on eco-territorial internationalism. But there's also the book that Hamza co-edited with Kendi that is about dismantling Green colonialism, so looking more specifically in the Arab region. So I highly recommend both. But the thing on the finally us perspective that we have in the global south is that countries like Brazil and Venezuela and many other places where they still have a lot of oil to dig into, they're saying, well, it's different now because we're going to do it ourselves. But they get stuck in the same problem of Dutch disease, never really gets away from it, the level of oil dependence and the traps around it. But these huge loss and damage traps right now, because what's happening is that when you have localized collapse, is when you have the most level externalization of the cost to the state and directly to the people. And then you have indebtedness of the state, but also indebtedness of the people. So a lot of these rescue, recovery, and reconstruction debates that we're having in Brazil right now, or we're having in Ukraine over the cost of war in Ukraine. So they are similar in that way. They involve de-risking the state. So a lot of construction companies are so stoked about what's coming in right now. We had like some people mentioned it to me that people were talking that the economy of the state of Rio Grande do Sul, Brazil, is going to grow a lot in the next few years. It's good. Why? Because we're going to have, these billions of dollars coming in terms of reconstruction projects. But what we actually see in reality will be the development. The gains that were made are being reversed. The costs are being leveraged against the state and against individuals, at the community level. The big proposal coming from the Ministry of the Economy in Brazil was line of credits for people to rebuild their houses. So you're a victim, and then now you get a new piece of debt. Or you can rescue money from your pension fund ahead of time without paying a penalty. So you've been saving up for something else, now you have to rebuild your house. The costs are completely getting externalized. Meanwhile, big corporations like Ambev in Brazil, that's have one of the big beverage corporations that we have, we're donating water. Look, we're the philanthropy around the corporations is very strong. But this leads to problems of peripherization as well, because what happens during reconstruction? How are we actually rebuilding things? Are we doing adaptation at the same time? Are we using principles around social justice? And are we going to go after territorial rights? Because the indigenous communities affected in Rio Grande do Sul, they have been marginalized and they faced violence for a long time. This is a state with a very strong agribusiness class. It is one of the states responsible for rice production in Brazil. And I think about Brazilians that we love our rice. But it's rice as commodity, rice for export. And now we're facing a rice crisis in Brazil because our current grain stocks were not at all up to the level that it should be to face a catastrophe. So there's a conversation on this that Raj Patel has been putting forwards around, the C's and the D's. So capitalism, colonization, and the D's around degrowth and what you can be doing in terms of having stocks for specific things. We're coming out with Alameda with the new dossier on food sovereignty and internationalist strategy. So my piece is on internationalism and food sovereignty specifically, but there's a piece by Raj Patel talking about this as well. So it's really absurd that you would have a country that exports food all over the place, and right now is having to import. It's one of its own staples because it didn't have enough stocks for dealing with it. So that's why the solution for this sovereignty with an expiry date, for me, comes about as ecological sovereignty. So the idea around ecological sovereignty is that it's not one thing, it's an ecosystem, or an ecosystemic perspective in how we understand a couple of things. How we understand access, control, production, and autonomy. And these can come in terms of asserting rights, but also what kind of life that you can build in that place. Whenever we're discussing eco-territorial approaches, we're discussing life. We're not discussing the production system itself. It is a consequence. If we're discussing life, the consequence is the production system, but it's a way of inverting where the logic comes from. So the ecological sovereignties, they're always interdependent, so they'll follow the competitiveness of the capitalist sovereignty. And it's really important to making sure that what do we get first? What are the basic things that we can ensure and then build from that so we can reach new levels of quality of living that actually get people enthusiastic about. So eco-territorial access, control, production, autonomy over food, energy, water, care, and time are some of the main pillars here. So that's the one in the bottom. Care and time being less tangible when we're dealing with it, food, energy, and water, but care and time being absolutely strategic to this discussion that we have around commony. So in ecological sovereignty, socialization is not enough. We don't want to just socialize labor and work and resources. We want to shift how we're producing and reproducing things to common spaces. And commony is a great way of looking into how we should be dealing with care. So there's some attention, for example, between ecofeminists and some other Marxist feminists where we're talking about housework. Because, housework should be acknowledged and should be paid for because it's unpaid labor. So this is one way of addressing it. The other way of addressing it is changing care work into common work as much as possible. So what kind of common spaces that we can be building? What different dynamics can come throughout it? And this will have huge consequences for patriarchal structure of the family, with how we raise our children. A lot of this knowledge is coming from indigenous knowledge. So this idea that it takes a village to raise a child is very strong in Latin America. But what we end up having is mostly fragmentation. I mean, yesterday was Mother's Day, and in my country, we have millions of people whose, father was never registered. So they don't know, level abandonment is really hard. So we have a lot of women who are solo mothers, and they've been doing, 2 to 3 times the same burden of work as men. So commoning actually helps here. And commoning is really important during crisis. It's really important during calamities. One of the major things that we have identified right now in Rio Grande do Sul is the importance of what I call solidarity kitchens. So people are coming together and they're cooking for each other. So it's not just Xing a resource and then you figure it out. It's making sure that you have a space that's together and that's quite connected to the other areas. And we see this in other situations as well. So we have a project that we're developing right now to try to understand, in Ukraine, the levels around food insecurity during the war. A lot of people who got displaced, it's not you can actually have access to a kitchen. So what is the value of community kitchens in this kind of tactics here? Something else that helps a lot is the right to say no before the right to say yes. Specifically when we're talking about energy projects around renewables or mining, so the extractivist system, a lot of people in territories that have known the only thing they have ever known is violence, is dispossession. So they come in, they take the resources, they poison our water, they poison our lungs, and that's it. The term sacrifice zones is not something that I take lightly. The idea of a sacrifice zone is not because people are affected, it's because their lives are seen as disposable, and those ecosystems are out for grabs or to be completely disposed of because they don't matter that much. They're somewhere else. They're kind of isolated. And sacrifice zones are not exclusive to the global south, to the periphery. You're going to find it everywhere else where somebody's voice is not worth enough, or because people are okay with it, so that's fine, we get rid of these words. So like the loss of biodiversity associated with it as well. We have consultation processes around the world. We have like, in the ILO, you can come to an indigenous community and you can say, do you want this project here or not? But these consultation processes they're built within the same system of dominance that has reproduced colonization for a really long time. Because the right to say no is not really there. There are pressures, there's cooptation, but if I'm saying that you have to have the right to say no before you actually have the right to say yes, it means guaranteeing territorial sovereignty in the first place. So understanding what kind of life is built there, and then working together from that. Because it is a reality. A lot of these strategic minerals, we do need them. Even if we have a huge revolution in our energy expenditure, there are a lot of things that we need to change. So we need to access resources. But the difference between extractivism and post-extractivism is that post-extractivism is not against using certain resources from nature. It's against the level of spoliation associated with commodity production that creates sacrifice zones to maintain a system of infinite, unsustainable, and just impossible accumulation at the end. So if we're going to go with the right to say no, you can build trust from it. You can actually ensure that people are protected from violence. What kind of right to say no do you have if you're facing violence every time? And then you put practice before discourse. If we can ensure there are perspectives for like changing, patterns of living in a more sustainable way, are about bringing people into a reality of care where they have more time, where they have access to each other, where you have like good community life, then it's easier to understand what kind of micro projects you can have in integration with others, and to try to like leverage negative impacts with a lot more gains. The real gains that are promised in development discourses in the global south, but actually not really reach the people down there. And this idea of saving time by giving back time. So you have like discussions around public luxuries around it, discussions that around convenience. A lot of waste that we have in society is because you don't have time, so you go in and buy prepackaged things. How do you get rid of prepackaged things if you just like, I know we should like do like slow food and slow cooking in your house all the time, but people are exhausted. But you need to create time for people. So you need to start commoning practices that create time. So it's not just the reduction of the work week. It's also how you reorganize society. And this means that, our radical transitions should be guided by radical sustainability. So like this more integrated perspective, and also reparations about compensation. So one of the things that I've been talking about in Brazil is that high, nice, very fine and dandy that we have a president that, cares in theory about climate change. He goes to Paris and then he says there's a huge historical climate debt. The rich countries developed at our cost, forgetting that Brazil is one of the top 10 historic emitters because of agribusiness. But uses that as a way of saying, now it's our turn to dig for oil ourselves and get all the benefits and develop. And so the discourse around the global inequality is actually being used to reproduce fossil fuels. To say, it's not strategic, right? You people, you have to transition first because I'm going to use fossil fuels now. And then what's left over for transitioning? We're already dealing with crazy levels of loss and damage. So we need proper reparations. And reparations, they don't come with like nice philanthropic funds from Norway to save the Amazon that might actually be used to cut through the Amazon to, help agribusiness take away more grain, into, export more grain. They come with the sense that, okay, this bill of like 5 to 10 billion euros right now, let's start issuing the bill. Who should be paying for this? So what kind of mechanisms for reparations that we can do in a way that also support the financial system? That is not about just regular grants or just about regular debt. It's actually about sending the bill and like associating this in a way that we're never going to find as long as loss and damage is being discussed from the world perspective here. And that means, to conclude, basically, that it includes us having, the ecosystemic approach to lots of perspectives, right? Nature, degrowth, solidaristic modes of living. So solidaristic modes of living as like this direction, as an alternative to the imperial mode of living, that's especially held by Ulrich Brandt and Max Wissen. The importance of racial justice, ecofeminism, having an internationalist perspective. So we're actually coordinating our pathways around just transition. I just published an article like last month on this, on how like a lot of unions in the automobile sector, they're actually paying a disservice when they're talking about just transition with the big three in the US, because it's all about perpetuating EVs. So let's ensure that we have good jobs when, General Motors goes completely towards EVs, right? And then what happens to the countries that are dealing either with a crazy amount of mining for EVs or the waste that comes with disposing of vehicles. We're talking about 1 billion vehicles on this planet, or like individual vehicles. It's not even logical. It's another way of it's unscientific to say that we're just going to replace all of these cars with EVs. And now, if you've been following, there's this whole thing of the 100% taxation of Chinese EVs into the US. And then they're saying, wow, this is really bad because, the big three, they're risking the transition in the US because they're doing very slow transition into EVs. And then we're not going to be able to bring all of these Chinese EVs into the US. But why are we focusing on EVs in the first place and not completely changing the mode of transportation? Wow, because it's just thinking in terms of economic growth and perpetuating the same systems around it. So internationalism is really important to ensure that we're not promoting not just false transitions, but false just transitions. Even in progressive circles, there are risks of unjust transitions because we're thinking from our own little economic perspective here, and we're not looking to sacrifice ones. We're not looking to the whole of the supply chain around it. And that makes these just transitions in these places just very reductionist. And they are actually preventing us from getting to more international solidarity in many areas as well. So I think I'm going to end here. That's good. Thanks. Bye.